Now begins the recitation of the Aletheon, the divine avataric self-revelation of his divine presence, Avatar Adida Samraj. Part 4, the 7 stages of life and the intrinsic transcending of all of the first 6 stages of life in the 7th stage way of Adidam. This is God talk, real God realization, most perfect divine self-awakening, and the 7 possible stages of life. 1. There are only 7 possible stages of life, and real a-causal God, or truth itself, or reality itself, may, in any moment, be talked about from the either real or imagined disposition of any one of them. However, actual, real God realization, or the realization of truth itself, or reality itself, is profoundly more than talk and thought, or even talking and thinking about talk. Indeed, the way of real God realization, or the way of the actual realization of truth itself, or reality itself, truly begins where and when talk and thinking ceases. 2. In the literature of Adidam, which is the way that I have revealed and demonstrated for the sake of all and all, I have described the 7 potential stages of human life. Briefly, the 7 stages of human life may be summarized as follows. In the context of the first 3 stages of life, the gross body-mind complex is developed and coordinated. First, the gross physical is developed. Then, the emotional sexual functions are developed and coordinated with the gross physical. And finally, the mental functions and the function of the will are developed and coordinated with the emotional sexual and gross physical functions. Optimally, all of this is nurtured, guided, and done in the context of love, trust, and surrender in relation to the living a-causal divine, or the all and all pervading and all transcending real a-causal God, or truth itself, or reality itself. In the context of the 4th stage of life, this now complex psychophysical being is surrendered beyond itself to and into the all and all pervading and all transcending and self-evidently divine source, or source condition, that pervades and yet transcends it and the total world. This surrender is done to the point of conditional union with that divine source, or source condition. In due course, such conditional union becomes, by means of divine grace, conditional union with the spiritual presence, or spiritual current, of that divine source, or of that divine source condition, truth itself, or reality itself, and this in occasions of tangible descending bliss that involve and simultaneously transcend the body-mind complex. In the context of the 5th stage of life, this process is continued, but the plane of conditional self-awareness ascends to become dominantly subtle or psychic, rather than gross or merely physical, and the realization of conditional union with the all and all pervading and all transcending divine source, or source condition, involves the ascent of attention that eventually goes beyond physical references and at last even beyond mental references. In the context of the 6th stage of life, attention, which is the causal root or base of the mind, is introverted, or by one or another means surrendered, away from gross and subtle states and objects of the body-mind complex, and toward its own root, even the ultimate root of the ego self, which is the witness consciousness, when attention is active, which is also, ultimately, consciousness itself, prior to objects and prior to the sense of separate self. The ultimate result of this exercise is conditional realization of the transcendental self-condition, or the intuition of self-existing transcendental being, which intuition remains strategically and otherwise tacitly disassociated from all objects, even if, as in the case of sixth stage Sahaja Nirvikalpa Samadhi, the natural perception and conception of phenomenal objects is freely allowed. In the only by me revealed and given seventh stage of life, there is prior and non-conditional, or inherent and inherently most perfect, self-identification with self-existing and self-radiant transcendental and self-evidently divine being, or the divine conscious light itself. The ultimate divine identity of all beings, or subjects, and the ultimate divine self-nature, self-condition, and self-state of all conditions or objects. This prior or inherent and inherently most perfect self-identification or divine self-abiding is directly realized by means of my divine avataric transcendental spiritual grace, entirely apart from any dissociative act of introversion, and while divinely self-abiding. Thus, if any conditions arise, or if any states of body-mind arise, they are simply divinely self-recognized in the self-existing and self-radiant self-nature, self-condition, and self-state of being, as transparent or merely apparent and non-necessary and intrinsically non-binding modifications of itself. Such is seventh stage Sahaja Nirvikalpa Samadhi, and it is inherently free of any apparent implications, limitations, or binding power of phenomenal conditions. If no conditions arise to the notice, there is simply the self-existing and self-radiant self-nature, self-condition, and self-state of transcendental, inherently spiritual, intrinsically egoless, and self-evidently divine being. Such is absolute or inherently most perfect realization of that about which nothing sufficient can be said, and there is not any one, anything, or anywhere beyond it to be realized. Individuals 3. Individuals at one or another stage or moment in the first 6 stages of life either pursue but do not yet most perfectly awaken to the realization of real acausal God, or of truth itself, or reality itself, or they otherwise submit to lesser purposes relative to self-fulfillment at any particular stage of life, or, in the context of either the 4th or the 5th or the 6th stage of life, because of the characteristic limitations of the particular stage of life, they submit to one or another conditionally achieved, conditionally determined, and conditionally limited form of presumed real God realization that is dependent upon the necessarily conditional exercise of the body or the body-mind or the mind or simple attention itself. Therefore, strictly speaking, real God realization, or the realization of truth itself, or reality itself, is a characteristic only of the only by me revealed and given, final and complete, or 7th stage of life. However, less strictly speaking, or as a matter of conventional reference, intended to honor the truly profound developmental demonstrations that may precede the only by my divine avataric transcendental spiritual grace-given realization of the 7th stage of life, the term real God realization and the term real God realizer may also be applied to cases and degrees of developmental demonstration in the context of either the 4th or the 5th or the 6th stage of life. 4. The first 3 stages of life, not informed or inspired by the wisdom of the fourth, the fifth, the sixth, or the seventh stage of life, are in themselves characterized by the pursuit of body-based self-fulfillment, even via self-indulgence or else via socially established conventions of morality, self-discipline, and rather materialistic hope. The fourth and the fifth stages of life, not informed or inspired by the wisdom of either the sixth or the seventh stage of life, are in themselves characterized by the pursuit of soul-based, or really mind-based or psyche-based, and natural energy-based, or even spirit-based self-glorification, at first via popular religious faith and practice, and then via every kind of progressively esoteric and possibly spiritual and otherwise yogic searching for eternal life or immortality, whether of body and soul or otherwise simply of soul. The sixth stage of life, which is the last of the egoic or ego-based and psychophysically determined stages of life, is characterized by one or more of three possible persuasions and efforts, each to one or another degree, yet influenced or limited by the fundamental presumption of the first five stages of life, and each of these three persuasions and efforts, even potentially following on one another progressively, pursues or at last affirms freedom from the body-mind self or the conditional self in the context of the cosmic round and the first five stages of life, by means of a particular mode of strategic disassociation from the body-mind self. And the only by me revealed and given seventh stage of life is characterized inherently and via a spontaneously self-unfolding demonstration by non-conditional or most perfect real God realization itself, or the absolute or most perfect realization of truth itself, or reality itself, utterly and intrinsically and most perfectly transcending egoity or self-bondage, separateness, and difference itself. 5. The first three stages of life are, from the disposition associated with any of the stages of life beyond them, the stages of gross ignorance, or the ordinary stages of progressive functional self-development, in themselves bereft of any influence or wisdom greater than material nature. From the disposition of any of the three orientations that are potential in the context of the sixth stage of life, the fourth and the fifth stages of life are the stages of subtle ignorance, or the stages of seeking toward the inherently impossible goal of an eternal or permanent, unopposed, and only happy, conditional state and conditional circumstance of self-perfection and self-fulfillment. And from the disposition of the only by me revealed and given seventh stage of life, even the sixth stage of life is limited by the basic illusion or by the basic apparent problem, or at least by strategic attention to the basic illusion or the basic apparent problem of a separate self, or of a substantively rather than merely apparent separate self-essence, or even essential and eternal or substantively permanent and unchanging ego-I. Thus, from the disposition of the only by me revealed and given seventh stage of life, the sixth stage of life is limited by causal ignorance, or the essence of ignorance, until, in the potential real transition to the only by me revealed and given seventh stage of life, only the non-conditional, or perfectly subjective absolute, or real acausal God, or truth, or reality itself is non-conditionally and inherently most perfectly realized as the obvious. 6. In the common world of bodily-based and socially communicated conventions of aspiration and action, there is always a struggle in evidence between the tendency of humankind to remain in gross ignorance, characterized by a materialistic culture of ego satisfactions and the necessity for humankind, one by one, to grow beyond the first three stages of life by the influence of wisdom, at least beginning with the faith principle associated with the earliest dimensions of the fourth stage of life. However, from the only by me revealed and given divine disposition of truth itself or reality itself, there is always an even greater necessity inherently urged upon all, which is for humankind, one by one, to perfectly or always intrinsically, priorly, and in every moment immediately, transcend even all of the first six or ego-based stages of life, to most perfectly realize the truly ultimate and inherent freedom of absolute being, self-existing as consciousness itself, and self-radiant as love bliss itself. 7. The ultimate or final stage of egoity and of the transcending of egoity is the sixth stage of life. Therefore, rightly understood, the first 5 stages of life are, in the context of the great tradition, a process of growth, of progressive psychophysical self-awareness, until the disposition of the 6th stage of life is truly and stably realized. When the point of view of gross ignorance and the pursuit of gross self-indulgence and gross or body-based self-fulfillment cease to be the limit of individual awareness, the point of view of subtle ignorance and the pursuit of subtle self-eternalization begins and develops progressively. At any time after that new beginning, or at the earliest, once the gross bodily point of view has been thoroughly released by submission to the subtle or psychic-based and natural energy-based, or even possibly spirit-based point of view, the point of view of the root self, prior to conditional nature, prior to body and mind, and therefore also prior to psyche or soul, may be realized, thus releasing even the subtle or psyche-based and natural energy-based point of view itself, and activating the potential, even possibly in spiritual terms, of the 6th stage of life. And the 6th stage of life, which is the ultimate seeking effort to achieve the transcending of egoity, is a course that is or may be progressively associated with one or more of 3 principal orientations in practice, either asceticism or the extreme orientation toward annihilation of the psychophysical self, or the more moderately self-disciplined course, an orientation toward pacification of the psychophysical self, or the ultimate course, an orientation toward non-conditional or perfectly subjective self-identification and tacit or effortless transcending of the psychophysical self. 8. In the great tradition, or common wisdom inheritance of humankind, the characteristic or grossly ignorant orientation of the first 3 stages of life in themselves or engaged for their own sake is always everywhere displayed in the common world to date, and every age or epoch displays its own unique convention or style of materialistic purposiveness. In the great tradition of humankind, the characteristic orientation of the 4th and 5th stages of life is found, first of all, in the traditional popular religions, such as Hinduism, Christianity, Islam, and Judaism, and in all the esoteric traditions of 4th and 5th stage mysticism and mystical spirituality, or descending and ascending yoga. In the great tradition of humankind, the characteristic orientation of the 6th stage of life is found in its first or ascetical form in such traditions as Samkhya and Jainism, and its second or moderate and self-pacifying or middle way form principally in the traditions or schools of Buddhism, and also in the schools of Taoism, and its third or final and conditionally or perfectly subjectively self-affirming form principally in traditions of or schools of Advaitism or non-dualism, especially that of Advaita Vedanta, and secondarily, or with less directness, within the schools of some varieties of Buddhism, especially within the Mahayana and Vajrayana traditions, and also, but with even less directness, within some schools of Taoism. In the great tradition of humankind, previous to my divine avataric appearance here, the characteristic or divinely or most perfectly enlightened orientation or disposition of the seventh stage of life has not been realized and demonstrated. There has been occasional seeming or suggestive evidence in the teachings of a random few unique individuals and traditions, especially within the schools of Advaitism, and secondarily or by or less direct and characteristic expression within some schools of Buddhism, and but with an even less direct and characteristic expression within some schools of Taoism, of limited foreshadowings or partial intuitions or insightful but limited premonitions of the characteristic or divinely or most perfectly enlightened orientation or disposition of the seventh stage of life. However, that evidence is only verbal or limited to expressions of a philosophical persuasion only, and a philosophical persuasion that is itself founded on the sixth stage orientation, practice and possible realization that preceded and still limits, in every case, the apparently seventh stage expression or teaching. 9. I am Adida Samraj, the avatar of reality itself, the perfect avatar, the all-completing and final avatar, the divine avatar, the original and eternal teacher, the divine avataric world teacher, here to complete and to completely transcend the great tradition of humankind. I am the all-completing adept, the first, last, and only divine avataric adept revealer of the seventh stage of life. I'm going to repeat that. I am the all-completing adept, the first, last, and only divine avataric adept revealer of the seventh stage of life. I am the seventh stage divine avataric realizer, divine avataric revealer, and divine avataric self-revelation of real acausal God, truth itself, and reality itself, given in this late time or would-be complete and potentially consummate era, and in this now dark epoch, as it must be described from the realized divine and transcendental spiritual disposition, and with regard to the tendencies of the times, and given for the sake of completion of the total human ordeal, and for the sake of unity, or the restoration of the cooperative prior unity of humankind. By means of my avatarically full-given divine word, I have revealed the characteristic and the to one degree or another, and in one manner or another, always limited design, and the to one degree or another, and in one manner or another, always ego-based nature of each and all of the first 6 stages of life, in and of themselves. Therefore, in order to enable all of humankind to practice and to realize the intrinsically egoless truth and way of life, I have, by means of my avatarically fully given divine word, revealed the unique and universal and inherently perfect way for all and all, which is the way of reality itself. The reality way I have revealed, and now and forever hereafter always give, is named by me the reality way of Adidam, or the divine avataric transcendental spiritual reality way of Adidam, or Adidam Ruchiradam. and which I also declare and name to be the way of is, or the transcendental spiritual reality way of is, and simply the way of reality itself, or the transcendental spiritual way of reality itself, and altogether the way of conscious light, or the transcendental spiritual reality way of conscious light, and the universal transcendental spiritual way of the heart, or the radical transcendental spiritual reality way of the true divine heart, or the radical reality way of the heart itself, or simply the radical reality way of the heart, and the way of perfect knowledge, or the transcendental spiritual reality way of perfect knowledge, and the way of radical, or always at the root, self-understanding, or the transcendental spiritual reality way of radical, or always at the root, self-understanding, or the transcendental spiritual reality way of the radical, or always at the root, transcending of egoity, and the way of no seeking, or the transcendental spiritual reality way of no seeking, and the way of radical devotional knowledge, or the transcendental spiritual reality way of radical devotional knowledge, and the way of divine ignorance, or the transcendental spiritual reality way of divine ignorance, or the transcendental spiritual reality way of perfect disillusionment, and the transcendental spiritual reality way of radical non-dualism, and the reality way of divine transcendental spiritual baptism. By whatever names and references I reveal and give and declare, the unique way I have full given by means of my avatarically self-uttered divine word, it is the reality way in which the ego is always directly, intrinsically, and in every moment, immediately transcended, without resort to any seeking methods, otherwise associated with any or all of the first 6 stages of life, and which is engaged entirely as a radical, or always at the root way of life in reality itself, and even from the beginning practiced only on the basis of my 7-stage reality teachings. By means of my avatarically full-given divine word, I have also revealed every characteristic, sign, design, and process associated with the realization and demonstration of the intrinsically and most perfectly egoless 7th and final stage of life, by means of my avatarically full-given divine work of demonstration and blessing. I have revealed the 7th stage of life in and by and as my own divinely avatarically born bodily human divine form and life, and I have altogether fulfilled my divine avataric revelation purpose by accomplishing through the universally both given and demonstrated divine accomplishing power of my all and all blessing divine avataric work, the firm establishment of that which is necessary for the eventual 7th stage realization, and finally, or most ultimately, divine translation of even all conditionally manifested beings. The great tradition of humankind, previous to my divine avataric appearance here, must generally be understood only in the necessarily limited terms of the first 6 stages of life. Whenever, even previous to my divine avataric appearance here, the 6th stage of life has been entered, the 7th stage of life has been, in principle, also the potential of human realization. However, the 7th stage of adept revelation was not then given, and it is only now given by me. The divine secrets of the true devotional and transcendental spiritual reality process of the radical transcending of egoity, and the divine secrets of the divine reality process of the most ultimate or 7th stage demonstration were not given previous to my divine avataric appearance here, and they are only now given by me. The always potential seven-stage realization and demonstration did not appear until I appeared, in order to fully reveal and to fully demonstrate the seventh stage of life, and by the very act of my fullest divine avataric appearance here and everywhere, and by means of all my unique divine avataric work of adept service here and everywhere, to make the seventh stage realization and demonstration possible for all who devotionally respond to me and who practice ego surrendering, ego forgetting, and intrinsically ego transcending devotion to me, and who altogether and firmly embrace and practice the only by me revealed and given reality way of Adidam. Therefore, relative to the seventh stage of life, the great tradition of humankind, previous to my divine avataric appearance here, produced only limited foreshadowings, or partial intuitions, or insightful but limited premonitions in the form of a few random philosophical expressions that appear in the midst of the traditional sixth stage literatures. And it is these few and yet limited traditional expressions that must be studied in order to understand the character and the degree of humankind's exploration of the possibility of the seventh stage of life previous to the now and forever future time of my full, real God revealing, truth revealing, and reality revealing divine avataric work and word. There are basically only 5 possible orientations or dispositions relative to reality, each built upon or outgrowing or transcending the one immediately previous to itself. The first, or the least, of these may be called conventional monism, according to this orientation or disposition. The world or cosmic nature is all there is, and it is a mere material unity, also expressed as the individual body-mind self, which is itself a material unity. And this disposition accounts for all lesser or gross or materialistic body-based and necessarily mortal orientations or searches in the always struggling and never truly or finally fulfilled context of the first 3 stages of life in the human domain. The second or next possible orientation or disposition may be called conventional dualism. According to this disposition, the world, or even the totality of existence, is made up of a number of principal pairs, whether simply natural or somehow otherwise hierarchical. Most typically, the first of these principal pairs is the hierarchically conceived pair of God and the world, with God commonly and even popularly conceived as combining both being and consciousness, and creative energy or creator energy. And the other principal and most typically hierarchically conceived pairs include God and the soul, or the psyche, or the subtle personality, and also the soul and the world, and also the mind, or the psyche, or the soul, and the body. Each half of each hierarchically conceived pair, or even each natural pair, is, according to this disposition, related to and interrelated with the other half of the pair. But paradoxically, and especially in the case of hierarchically conceived pairs, each half of each pair is also utterly different than, or even inherently separate from, the other half of the pair. And the obligatory goal of each presumed lesser or dependent half of each hierarchically related pair is to submit to, and eventually even to ascend to, the greater or higher half of the pair. Therefore, from this disposition, the soul and even the total world must submit to and eventually ascend to God or God realization. Likewise, the body must submit or be submitted to the mind or the psyche or the soul. Indeed, all that which is in the human being which in the human being is of the world must, according to the hierarchical conception, submit or be submitted to, and in turn be relinquished by the soul, which must itself in turn, and by submitting to God and to the urge to God realization, eventually and progressively ascend to God. And this total process is, indeed, the total process characteristically and traditionally associated with the fourth and the fifth stages of life. And such great fourth and fifth stage popular or exoteric and otherwise esoteric traditions as have appeared in or among the forms of Hinduism, Christianity, Islam, and Judaism, and in their own unique manners in or among the forms of Taoism, and also uniquely even in or among some forms of Buddhism. The third and next possible orientation or disposition may be called primary dualism. According to this disposition, the totality of existence is an apparent combination of only two primary realities. These primary realities are traditionally within the cultural sphere of India called Purusha, or non-conditional, and as such inherently perfect and perfectly and necessarily subjective being and consciousness, and Prakriti, or objective energy, which, modified, appears as the body, the mind, all objects, and all others. From this disposition, this primary duality must, first of all, be understood by observation and intuition to be actual or really so. Then Purusha, or the conscious self, which, according to the characteristic and paradoxical traditional disposition of primary dualism, is ultimately a perfect subjective or non-conditional, but also specific, independent, and individual self, must separate self, basically by willful ascetical discipline, from Prakriti, or the body, the mind, all their objects, and all others. And this disposition and process, which seeks to be realized from the body-mind complex, or from the illusory need to eternalize the body, the mind, or the entire body-mind complex, is the first possible disposition and process traditionally associated with the sixth stage of life and such great sixth stage traditions as have appeared with Jainism and the ancient philosophical tradition of Samkhya. The fourth and next to last possible orientation or disposition may be called secondary non-dualism or secondary absolute monism. According to this disposition, there is no inherently independent and separate or separable Purusha, either as an eternal and non-conditional individual self, or, according to some proponents, as absolute being itself, or absolute consciousness itself. But the totality of existence is only Prakriti, conditionally appearing as a beginningless and endless continuum of causes and effects, or, in effect, modifications of Prakriti, or of energy itself. Therefore, according to this disposition, energy itself appears and must be so observed only as ephemeral and observable or objective changes, preceded and followed by equally ephemeral and equally observable or objective changes, until, by the process of observation, insight, and self-pacification, the inherent or original or nirvanic state of energy itself is realized. However, there is an ultimate paradox necessarily associated with this orientation or disposition and process. For, if the realization of the original or nirvanic state of energy itself is, in fact, achieved, how can that realization be differentiated from, or otherwise be presumed to be, other than or not identical to, absolute consciousness itself? In any case, This disposition and process, which seeks to be released from both the illusory need to eternalize the conditional self and the equally illusory need to annihilate the conditional self, and which point of view and process may therefore follow upon or otherwise supersede the disposition and process of primary dualism, is the second possible disposition and process traditionally associated with the sixth stage of life, and such great sixth stage schools as have appeared within the traditions of Buddhism and also within the tradition of Taoism. The fifth and final possible orientation or disposition may be called ultimate non-dualism or primary absolute monism. According to this disposition, there is, in truth, no prakriti, or separate and independent objective energy, or any separate and independent body, mind, object, or other at all. But the totality of existence is only the one and absolute Purusha, or self-existing and self-radiant consciousness itself. From this disposition, this ultimate absolute, or this non-conditional and as such inherently perfect and perfectly subjective reality must, first of all, be understood and directly intuited to be actual or really so, and then perfectly or utterly affirmed by direct self-identification with consciousness itself. This disposition and process, which may follow upon or be uncovered by the disposition and process of secondary non-dualism, and which may even immediately follow upon or be uncovered by the disposition and process of primary dualism, is the third and final and principal possible disposition and process traditionally and inherently associated with the sixth stage of life, and such greater sixth stage schools as have appeared in the form of the traditions of Advaitism, and also secondarily or with less directness within the schools of some varieties of Buddhism, especially within the Mahayana and Vajrayana traditions, but with even less directness within some of the schools of Taoism. Most ultimately, this disposition and process of ultimate non-dualism or primary absolute monism is, if it is, by means of my avatarically self-transmitted divine transcendental spiritual grace, most perfectly realized, the disposition and the most perfect process that, by all graceful means, I have revealed and given for the sake of all who will be my devotees, especially establishes and characterizes the seventh stage of life. And because from the thoroughly non-dualistic disposition that necessarily characterizes the seventh stage of life, the ultimate absolute is both self-existing as absolute being itself and absolute consciousness itself, and self-radiant as absolute and perfectly subjective transcendental spiritual love bliss energy itself. It, or that one, could, as well as by many other possible and even traditional terms, be rightly indicated interchangeably by either the traditionally Sanskrit term Purusha, intended in the absolute, all-inclusive, or non-exclusive and non-dualistic sense, or the likewise intended traditional Sanskrit term Mahapurusha, meaning great Purusha, or supreme Purusha, or the likewise intended traditional Sanskrit term Purushottama, also meaning supreme Purusha, indicating in each case the one, absolute and non-separate, or inherently all-inclusive, or perfectly non-exclusive real acausal God, or truth itself, or reality itself. 11. Even though the schools of primary dualism, such as are to be found within the traditions of Samkhya and Jainism, contain, by virtue of the very presumption of dualism, at least a tendency toward practices and or experiences associated with the ascent of the soul. The primary language of all traditions of primary dualism suggests not only the utter relinquishment of all physical, psychophysical, and psychic conditions and states, but also the utter relinquishment of all physical, psychophysical, and psychic means. Indeed, the sixth-stage ultimate goal, or result, of primary dualism is the same as that of secondary non-dualism and ultimate non-dualism. However, the philosophy and practice associated with the schools of primary dualism, principally within the traditions of Samkhya and Jainism, are built upon an analysis of existence as experienced from the gross or bodily point of view. Therefore, the method of primary dualism is primarily ascetical, or a bodily intensive effort to relinquish or to release the deep being from body consciousness and all psychophysical states. The sixth stage ultimate goal or result of secondary non-dualism is the same as that of primary dualism and ultimate non-dualism. However, the philosophy and practice associated with the schools of secondary non-dualism, principally within the traditions of Buddhism and also within the tradition of Taoism, are built upon an analysis of existence as experienced from the subtle or mental or even energy essence point of view. Therefore, the Buddhist method of secondary non-dualism is primarily associated with mental disciplines, originally classified under the heading of the discipline of mindfulness, or simple observation and comprehension of psychophysical states, and later extended in the form of a wide variety of religious, philosophical, and yogic techniques. And by this method, the Buddhist form of secondary non-dualism seeks to pacify the total body-mind, and thus and thereby to relinquish or be released from the idea of separate and independent self. Similarly, although the Taoist method of secondary non-dualism is primarily associated with disciplines of natural energy or disciplines of body and mind in relationship to pervasive natural energy, rather than sheerly or primarily mental disciplines or even mind energy disciplines, the Taoist method of secondary non-dualism also pursues a general pacification of the total body-mind. Thus, in whatever tradition it may appear, the method of secondary non-dualism seeks and achieves detachment and release from the body-mind complex through a process of general psychophysical specifications. Through a process of general psychophysical pacification, whereas the method of primary dualism seeks and achieves detachment and release from the body-mind complex through an intense ascetical effort, often characterized by excessive bodily self-denial. The method of ultimate non-dualism is a matter of direct or non-conditional self-identification with that which is the generally intended sixth-stage goal of both primary dualism and secondary non-dualism. That is to say, the philosophy and practice associated with the schools of ultimate non-dualism, principally in the traditions of Advaitism and secondarily or with less directness in some schools of Buddhism, and with even less directness in some schools of Taoism, are built upon or developed from an analysis or a direct comprehension of existence as experienced, or rather witnessed, from the disposition of consciousness itself, rather than the point of view of either the body or the mind. And the method of ultimate non-dualism is that of standing tacitly and effortlessly as consciousness itself, or the ultimate and perfectly or non-conditionally subjective reality itself, which is inherently free of egoic self-identification with the body-mind complex, and therefore priorly released from egoic self-identification with, or bondage to and by the body-mind complex. Thus, the method of ultimate non-dualism is one of direct or perfect subjective self-identification with or self-abiding as that which is otherwise only the generally intended sixth-stage goal of the ascetical conditional efforts of primary dualism and the self-pacifying conditional efforts of secondary non-dualism. The self-abiding discipline of ultimate non-dualism also achieves the renunciation of body and mind, but by the most direct means of perfectly subjective self-abiding, whereas primary dualism and secondary non-dualism both seek ultimate non-duality by the conditional means of either asceticism or self-pacification. However, it is also generally the case in actual practice that the real process of self-abiding or direct and profound self-identification with consciousness itself prior to body and mind begins or develops only after or in the course of degrees of practice previous to the sixth stage of life, or otherwise in the context of the sixth stage of life, wherein either ascetical or self-pacifying disciplines, or both, with ascetical disciplines usually becoming progressively replaced by the more self-pacifying approach, are engaged until egoic self-identification with the body and the mind is sufficiently released to stably allow the direct approach of non-conditional self-identification with consciousness itself. In the context of the sixth stage of life, the disposition and process of primary dualism may or may not fully appear, but it invariably appears in the context of the sixth stage of life, or earlier, as a tendency in mind and body toward excessive self-discipline or extreme and fruitless asceticism. Therefore, if this tendency appears, it must eventually be understood, and it must then be replaced by a more moderate tendency toward self-discipline or self-renunciation, which may or may not itself fully appear in the context of the sixth stage of life as the orientation of secondary non-dualism, but which is nonetheless characterized at any stage of life by a motive toward the transcending of egoity that, in itself, would achieve a state of utter self-purification or utter self-pacification. Utter self-purification or utter self-pacification is not possible, and in any case, it is not itself real God realization or the realization of truth itself or reality itself. Therefore, if the only by me revealed and given seventh stage of life is to be realized, the limits of or the search associated with the moderate and necessary orientation toward self-renunciation must eventually be understood, and even the motive of self-renunciation must then, in the context of the sixth stage of life, be itself transcended simply and most directly through prior self-identification with the inherently perfect and perfectly subjective and self-evidently divine non-dual or absolute self-existing and self-radiant truth itself or reality itself, which is existence or being itself, consciousness itself, and love bliss itself. And in the ultimate course of this ultimate process, final and complete or seventh stage real God realization itself, or the non-conditional or absolute or inherently most perfect realization of truth itself, or reality itself, becomes perfectly possible by means of my avatarically self-transmitted, divine, transcendental, spiritual grace. 12. The word religion has traditionally been understood as meaning to bind again, or to rejoin, or to make or otherwise affirm the great union. Therefore, common or exoteric or conventional religion, most of which is confined to aspirations and activities in the context of the first three stages of life, largely consists of ritualized magic, political and moral imperatives, and myths that idealize the good man and the good woman. And by such common or exoteric or conventional religion, human beings may, it is hoped, be effectively oriented by everyday cultural means toward behaviors that positively address and serve the personal and collective material survival potentiality of their body-based humanity. Conventional or traditional esoteric spirituality is characteristically oriented toward the profound and now an anciently honored sacred process of realizing that condition which is itself inherently and only and perfectly one. Therefore, strictly speaking, true and traditionally rather esoteric spirituality truly begins no earlier than when conventional or materialistic and body-based monism is at least beginning to be replaced by conventional or eternalistic and psyche-based dualism. The principal idea of exoteric religion is that all things and beings are in and of a unity. Therefore, the principal practice of exoteric religion, or religion in the general context of the first three stages of life, is the ritual and otherwise magical or even scientific, and also ethical or social moral affirmation, and it is hoped demonstration of the universal and even material unity. The principal idea of traditional esoteric spirituality is that all things and beings are only mind, or a psychic phenomenon, or merely a psychic illusion. Therefore, the practice of traditional esoteric spirituality is a matter of either the practice of intentional exploitation of mind towards its higher development, or the practice of attempting to transcend the mind itself. The lesser response to the principal idea of traditional esoteric spirituality is the seeking effort, characteristic of the fourth and the fifth stages of life, to develop the mind and thus the conditional self and the conditional world or worlds. The greater or ultimate response to the principal idea of traditional esoteric spirituality is the seeking effort characteristic of the sixth stage of life, to transcend the mind and thus the illusion of the conditional self and conditional world or worlds. And, as I have now and fully revealed and demonstrated to all, the way of reality itself can begin only when all aspects of the first six stages of life are, by means of my divine avataric transcendental spiritual grace, relinquished and transcended, and the only by me revealed and given seven-stage way of reality, realization of that ultimate non-duality, which is real a causal God, or a causal truth itself, or a causal reality itself, and which is one and perfection itself. So be it. (13) From the point of view of the gross body or gross conditional existence, everything, including mind and consciousness, is perceived, conceived, and presumed to be an irreducibly material, finite, mortal process. From the point of view of the mind or subtle conditional existence, everything, including the gross body and all gross conditions, is perceived, conceived, and presumed to be, in effect, made of the infinite objective substance, or the infinite cosmic reservoir of indestructible and ultimately indivisible cosmic light, or cosmic mind itself, and caused by and within the infinite totality of cosmic mind. And even the totality of cosmic mind, including the individual mind and consciousness itself, is thus presumed to be cosmic light itself, or not other than cosmic mind itself. From the disposition of consciousness itself, everything conditional, objective, or objectified, whether gross or subtle or causal, is perceived, conceived, and presumed to be consciousness itself, or the ultimate and transcendental and inherently spiritual, or love blissful and perfectly subjective reality itself, such that conditional, objective, or objectified reality is inherently realized to be a merely apparent modification or an illusory play of, in, and upon the native radiance or intrinsic self-radiance of consciousness itself. These three primary perceptions, conceptions, or presumptions also correspond variously to the 7 potential stages of life. The perception, conception, or presumption based on the point of view of gross conditional existence corresponds to the conventional perception, conception, or presumption associated with the first 3 stages of life, and the cultural and general social bias toward scientism or scientific materialism, or the gross body-bound mentality that seeks, by means of gross body-based knowing, to achieve power or manipulative advantage over the natural world, and which tends and even seeks to bind or limit humankind to gross conditional nature and to the even ancient tradition and philosophy of gross materialism, exemplifies this lower or mundane or adolescent orientation. The 4th stage of life is a transitional stage or process originally grounded in or naturally associated with the gross conditional point of view of the first 3 stages of life, but awakening progressively toward the potential point of view, the perception, the conception, and the presumption of subtle conditional existence, mind or total cosmic mind, and cosmic light, and the process associated with the transition to and through the 4th stage of life is the source of popular creationist or creator God religions, as well as the popular or less developed forms of sainthood. The perception, conception, or presumption based on the point of view of subtle conditional existence, mind and cosmic light in itself, or cosmic mind in itself, corresponds to the perception, conception, or presumption associated with the 5th stage of life, and the conceptions and practices associated with the 5th stage of life are the primary traditional sources of all that is commonly known as higher esoteric or secret and mystical spirituality. The perception, conception, or presumption based on the disposition of consciousness itself corresponds, in its yet ego-based, object-excluding mode, to the perception, conception, or presumption associated with the 6th stage of life. And the 6th stage of life is the basic or common source of transcendentalist conception and traditions of enlightenment or liberation. Any one of the 3 primary modes of perception, conception, or presumption I have just described could be and is affirmed by individuals, groups, and traditions in the human sphere. But which one of the 3 modes is ultimately correct or expressive of truth itself? It is the 3rd, or the perception, conception, or presumption based on the disposition of consciousness itself, but only in the intrinsically egoless mode of the only by me revealed and given 7th stage of life. Why? Because no matter what arises as your experience or knowledge, whether gross or subtle or causal, and whether of body or of mind, you are the witness of it, and that which is the witness is consciousness itself. No matter what arises, you are consciousness itself. You are never really or in truth, separately identical to, or even really or in truth limited by, what is apparently objective or functionally objectified to you. But you tend to feel or presume specific or separate identification with, or otherwise limitation by, objective or objectified conditions until you are able to inspect and to be intrinsically and inherently perfectly self-identified with your real or native or intrinsic and inherently perfect situation, which is always already free or acausally self-existing consciousness itself. The inherently free subject or perfectly subjective being in the apparent context of conditional objects or of apparently objectified light, and who, it must be realized, is the acausally self-existing, acausally self-radiant, and self-evidently divine self-nature, self-condition, and self-state, or intrinsic being or reality person of the one and only and intrinsically indivisible and intrinsically egoless conscious light that is always already prior to all conditional objects and always already prior to apparently objectified light or apparently objectified transcendental spiritual energy itself. Therefore, the points of view of body and mind and their perceptions, conceptions, or presumptions are necessarily subordinate and secondary to and utterly dependent upon the intrinsic self-nature, self-condition, and self-state of consciousness itself. The perceptions, conceptions, or presumptions based on the points of view of body and mind could not even be made were body and mind not always already founded in or apparently witnessed by consciousness itself. Therefore, the perception, conception, or presumption based on the disposition of consciousness itself is also beyond the object excluding limitations of the sixth stage of life, the root essence of the divine self-realization of reality itself, that is the very basis and context of the only by me revealed and given seventh stage of life. When, in the divine self-awakening to the only by me revealed and given seventh stage of life, the body-mind self and the conditional worlds are finally, divinely, self-recognized to be transparent or merely apparent and non-necessary and intrinsically non-binding modifications of the by me avatarically self-revealed, transcendental, inherently spiritual, intrinsically egoless, and self-evidently divine self-nature, self-condition, source condition, and self-state, then there is only me. Only the you that is non-separately beyond the ego I, not different from me as I am. Only one self. Only real acausal God. Only truth itself. Only reality itself. Only intrinsically egoless and transcendentally spiritual, bright consciousness. Only divine love bliss. Only the perfectly subjective and tacit self-apprehension of being itself. Only the one and only and intrinsically indivisible and intrinsically egoless conscious light that is, even as all and all, and that is always already perfectly prior to all and all. 14. The first 5 stages of life correspond to the conditionally apparent psychophysical manifestations of the gross and the subtle structures and functions of the body-mind complex. The 6th stage of life corresponds to the conditionally apparent root of the gross and the subtle psychophysical structures and functions which conditionally apparent root is the causal structure and function of the body-mind complex. The only by me revealed and given perfect practice of perfect knowledge involves the disposition that intrinsically transcends the strategic exercise of the gross and the subtle and the causal structures and functions of conditionally apparent existence as a body-mind self. Thus, in the only by me revealed and given reality way of Adidam, the perfect practice of perfect knowledge intrinsically transcends even the causal body or the causal dimension of structure and function, without otherwise, in the sixth-stage manner, strategically excluding or disassociating from the body-mind complex in the world. The foundation of fifth-stage traditions is the subtle body, or the subtle dimension of structure and function, and the generally esoteric process of yoga with reference to the psychophysical context of the rather complex domain that is the subtle body, and also the subtle body in continuity with the gross body, or the gross dimension of structure and function. The sixth-stage error is associated with the psychophysical mechanism of the causal body, but the causal body is not thereby functionally exploited in terms of its root content, which is essentially attention itself. Rather, in the sixth-stage traditions, the characteristic of the practice is so strategically disassociate from the entire domain of gross, subtle, and causal conditions is to Rather, in the sixth-stage traditions, the characteristic of the practice is to strategically disassociate from the entire domain of gross, subtle, and causal conditions. Such is the sixth-stage disposition, and the strategy of disassociation is the root error or yet continuing limitation in the sixth-stage traditions. That error is not the case in the only by me revealed and given seventh stage of life, or even in the foundation or first and second stages of the only by me revealed and given perfect practice of perfect knowledge. There are elements of the structures and functions of psychophysical existence that are relevant to the demonstration or apparent life manifestation of the seventh stage of life. But the seventh stage of life is not itself founded on the exercise of the structures and functions of the body-mind complex. The seventh stage of life is priorly, or always already, established in and as the intrinsically self-evident self-nature, self-condition, and self-state that is reality itself. The characteristic of the seventh stage of life is divine self-recognition of all and everything that is apparently arising, and not any exercise of psychophysical structures and functions at all. Therefore, in the seventh stage of life, there is no dependency on or limitation by psychophysical mechanisms, as there is inherently in each and all of the first six stages of life. In the great tradition of humankind, there are no seventh-stage traditions, but there are genuine sixth-stage traditions, and there are lesser traditions that are not quite truly sixth stage, and there are all the traditions previous to the sixth stage. The fifth stage traditions are associated with the psychophysical structures of the subtle body and otherwise all the aspects of the subtle body and the gross body. In that position, you have a world to account for and a universe that must itself, as a totality, be accounted for. You may resort to the apparent self-position by fifth stage means, but even then, you have yet to somehow account for a universe. In the seventh stage of life, there is no effort or impulse to account for a universe. because there is self-evidently no separate universe. None. In the seventh stage of life, there is the divine self-nature, self-condition, and self-state only. In the sixth stage traditions, there is no particular necessity to account for a universe, because the sixth stage of life is strategically oriented to the self-nature, self-condition, and self-state that is prior to conditional existence. But that strategic orientation is itself a causal-based effort to disassociate from conditional existence. The seventh stage of life is, likewise, founded on the self-nature, self-condition, and self-state that is prior to psychophysical conditions. But there is, in the seventh stage disposition, no effort or requirement to disassociate from psychophysical conditions. The seventh stage of life simply has nothing to do with a world over against the divine self-nature, self-condition, and self-state. In the seventh stage of life, there is only the divine self-nature, self-condition, and self-state itself. I use the phrase self-nature, self-condition, and self-state to indicate that in the seventh stage of life, there is no world that is experienced or presumed apart from the divine self-nature, self-condition, and self-state itself. The divine self-nature, self-condition, and self-state is the perfectly acausal source condition or intrinsically self-evident self-nature, self-condition, and self-state of the world. The divine self-nature, self-condition, and self-state is the one reality, and it does not have to emanate or create or in any manner make a world happen. That is a paradox from the point of view of conventional understanding, because conventional understanding is attached to point of view in space-time and to structures of a psychophysical kind. That is where notions of self and world come from, and even if a big S self and a big W world are presumed to be the case, such notions also represent a category of thinking structured by point of view, or in fundamental terms, egoity. I have uniquely revealed what precedes the seventh stage of life, what is required for the realization of the seventh stage of life, what is specific to the realization of the seventh stage of life, and how the seventh stage of life is demonstrated as a process of 4 phases. None of this has ever been uttered before in human history. None of this has ever been previously accounted for. None of this has previously been known. There are no seventh stage traditions previous to my divine avataric self-revelation. The only by me revealed and given reality way of Adidam is uniquely a communication of the seventh stage of life. Therefore, the only by me revealed and given reality way of Adidam is a unique accounting for all traditions and all points of view, or all perspectives on truth and reality that precede the seventh stage of life, and that are, therefore, in the categories of psychophysical egoity and the conventions of natural realism that are commonly supposed. Reality itself is not knowable to point of view. Reality itself is not knowable to the position of egoity. Therefore, reality itself is not knowable from the position of the body-mind complex, because the body-mind complex is a point of view machine. No conditional or psychophysical point of view or disposition is the disposition of reality itself. You cannot see a room as a totality, as it necessarily is, with reference to every possible point of view in space-time, by assuming any one particular space-time point of view inside or outside the room. Truth itself, or reality itself, has nothing to do with point of view. It has nothing to do with the body-mind self. It has nothing to do with the structures and categories of point of view, and therefore of psychophysical experiencing. All ideas of the self, whether big S self or small s self, and the world, whether big W world or small w world, and how to account for the total conditionally apparent universe, are talking modes of conventional or natural realism. All of that is point of view talk. All of that is not only the fundamental sign and characteristic mind of egoity, but it is also the fundamental sign and characteristic mind of the totality of the first 6 stages of life. The 6th stage of life has a dimension in which it is essentially free of point of view thinking, but the 6th stage of life otherwise depends on a root gesture of exclusion, which must yet be transcended. The only by me revealed and given 7th stage of life exceeds all categories of point of view and all structures of a psychophysical nature. The 7th stage of life stands prior to all conditional perspectives and dependencies. The demonstration of the 7th stage of life can be seen in the context of psychophysical events, but that demonstration is not itself a process of psychophysical events. Rather, that demonstration is priorly self-standing, as that which is always already the case. The 7th stage of life is not bound or limited by any conditional category whatsoever. It is the free demonstration of the absolute, and fundamentally, the 7th stage of life has nothing to do with the universe or with the apparent phenomena of conditional existence. Ultimately, the only by me revealed and given 7th stage of life demonstrates itself as divine translation, the outshining of the conditional domain in the divine self-domain. That is not a process accounted for in the great tradition of humankind. The great tradition of humankind has accounted at the maximum for the 6th stage of life, the first immediate step beyond the point of view machine. The psychophysical structures of the human being are at the root of each of the first 6 or inherently egoic stages of life. One mode or another of psychophysics, gross to subtle to causal, is the root of each of the egoic stages of life. By examining the language and the proceedings and the practices of any given tradition, it is possible to identify what stage of life is speaking through the philosophical language of that tradition. However, on the basis of examining only the philosophical language of a tradition, without also examining the proceedings and practices of that tradition, it is sometimes difficult to determine what stage of life that language is referring to. The Sahaja Nirvikalpa Samadhi of the 4th stage of life, or of the 5th stage of life, or of the 6th stage of life, makes characteristic utterances that are, in some respects, similar in each case, whether 4th or 5th or 6th stage in origin. Therefore, it is virtually impossible to differentiate such utterances from one another without rightly applying the only by me revealed and given discriminative tools of the seventh stage of life perspective, fully and exactly as I have indicated. Therefore, relative to any mode of utterance, it must be asked, what kind of process does realization depend upon in the tradition being considered? What aspect of psychophysical structure or function, gross, subtle, or causal, is at the root of the utterances and the practices of the tradition in question? Such inquiry is the means that I have given for understanding every tradition and every kind of philosophical proposition within the great tradition of humankind. Therefore, the right exercise of the only by me revealed and given tools of discrimination include my descriptive accounting for the 7 possible stages of life, is a unique discipline of thorough examination and of altogether right comprehension. 15. There are 3 egos, or 3 fundamental modes of egoity, or of the self-contraction, active, psychophysical illusion of separate and separative self-consciousness. The 3 modes of egoity, or of the self-contraction, of any point of view or ego I, or are the lower self or gross ego, the higher self or subtle ego, and the root self or causal ego. These 3 egos, or modes of the conditionally arising illusion of separate self-consciousness, comprise the total conditionally perceiving and conditionally knowing ego I. The total or tripartite ego I is always directly, with always immediate effectiveness, transcended in the right, true, and full or complete formal practice of the only by me revealed and given reality way of Adidam, which is the right, true, and full formal practice of whole bodily recognition, responsive devotional turning to me. The first of the 3 egos or modes of egoity or of self-contraction to be always directly transcended and the only by me revealed and given reality way of Adidam is the money, food, and sex ego, or the social and altogether gross body-based personality, or the gross pattern and activity of self-contraction, which is the lower self, or the ego of the first 3 stages of life. The second of the 3 egos, or modes of egoity, or of self-contraction, to be always directly transcended in the only by me revealed and given reality way of Adidam, is the brain-mind ego, or the brain-based and nervous system-based, mental and perceptual and altogether subtle body-based illusions of object and other, or the subtle pattern and activity of self-contraction, which is the higher self, or the ego of the 4th and 5th stages of life. The third of the 3 egos, or modes of egoity or of self-contraction, to be always directly transcended in the only by me revealed and given reality way of Adidam, is the root ego, or the exclusively disembodied and mindless but separate and altogether causal body-based self-consciousness, or the causal or root causative pattern and activity of self-contraction, which is attention itself, and which is the root itself, or the ego of the 6th stage of life. By means of responsive relinquishment of self-contraction in me, or really and truly ego-surrendering, ego-forgetting, and intrinsically and at last most perfectly ego-transcending, or always directly self-contraction transcending devotion to me, and thus, by means of the right, true, and full formal practice of devotionally me recognizing and devotionally to me responding, whole bodily turning to me. The tripartite ego, otherwise unfolding via the patterns of the first 6 stages of life, or the psychophysical totality of the 3-part hierarchically patterned self-contraction into separate and separative point of view, is always directly and with always immediate effectiveness transcended in me, the eternally self-existing, infinitely self-radiant, intrinsically egoless, perfectly subjective, indivisibly one, irreducibly non-separate, transcendental spiritual, self-evidently divine, and now and forever hereafter, avatarically self-revealed, self-conscious light of reality itself. The ultimate, final, and inherently most perfect, or 7th stage, realization of me requires, as a necessary prerequisite, an ego-transcending, or really and truly and comprehensively self-contraction transcending great process. The ultimate, final, and inherently most perfect, or 7th stage realization of me requires, as a necessary prerequisite, the comprehensive, by me revealed and by me given, and always directly ego-transcending, right practice of life in the formal context of the only by me revealed and given reality way of Adidam. And as a necessary prerequisite to the ultimate, final, and inherently most perfect, or 7th stage realization of me, the particular illusions that are unique to each of the 3 egos or basic modes of egoity, each require a particular and most profound mode of necessary ego transcending or self-contraction transcending great process of the by me revealed and by me given formal practice of the reality way of Adidam. The foundation phase of the always directly ego-transcending great process of the only by me revealed and given reality way of Adidam is the devotional and in due course transcendental, spiritual, listening, hearing process of always directly and with always immediate effectiveness, transcending and in due course most fundamentally understanding the lower self, or the gross and social ego, and the gross and social fear, sorrow, and anger bondage that is always associated with the inherent egoic or thoroughly self-contracted search to absolutely fulfill and even to utopianize or to perfectly and permanently satisfy the inherently conditional, limited, temporary, mortal, gross, and always changing life patterns of money, food, and sex. Before the foundation phase, or first phase of the ego-transcending great process of the only by me revealed and given reality way of Adidam can itself be complete, it must realize a profoundly life-transforming and life-reorienting positive disillusionment, or a most fundamental and really and truly self-contraction transcending acceptance of the fact that gross conditional existence is inherently and necessarily unsatisfactory and unperfectible, and, therefore, a most fundamental and really and truly me-finding and search-ending acceptance of the fact that all seeking to achieve permanent and complete gross satisfaction of separate body, emotion, and mind is inherently and necessarily futile. Only on the basis of that necessary foundation realization of positive disillusionment can the functional life energy and the attention of the entire body-mind complex, or of the total body-mind, body-brain-mind, be released from gross ego bondage or self-deluded confinement to the psychophysical illusions of gross self-contraction. The characteristic sign of positive disillusionment relative to the permanent and complete satisfaction of the lower self, or the separate and separative gross and social ego is the foundation realization of the prior and inherent universal unity, or all and all-inclusive interdependence and common cause and effect mutuality of gross conditional and cosmic existence, such that the inherently loveless or anti-participatory and non-integrative self-contraction effort of the gross separate self is constantly released, or to me, responsively self-surrendered into participatory and integrative attitudes of human, social, and cosmic unification or love connectedness with all and all, and into love-based and truly ego-transcending actions that transcend the otherwise separative or anti-participatory and non-integrative tendencies of the ego I. Thus, by means of devotionally me recognizing and devotionally to me responding relinquishment, or participatory and love-based transcending of psychophysical self-contraction to the degree of positive disillusionment relative to gross conditional experience and gross conditional knowledge, my true devotee is inherently released toward and into the true transcendental spiritual and not merely gross or even at all conditional realization of reality itself and truth itself, or real acausal God. The foundation realization of positive disillusionment requires fundamental release from the confines of the grossly objectified and grossly absorbed subject-object point of view, or fundamental release from the inherently ego-bound or thoroughly self-contracted search of relatively externalized mental and perceptual attention, and that foundation realization of positive disillusionment and restoration to the humanly, socially, and cosmically participatory or wholly integrative disposition requires the total and truly devotional transformative reorienting, and altogether the right purification, steady rebalancing, and ego-transcending, life-positive energizing of the entire body-mind, or the total body-brain-mind. Therefore, the foundation or gross phase of the always directly ego-transcending practice of the only by me revealed and given reality way of Adidam necessarily requires much seriousness and much profundity in order to establish the necessary and truly positively disillusioned foundation of the true and truly in me surrendered hearing of me, or the only by me revealed and given unique ego-transcending capability of most fundamental self-understanding. The middle phase of the always directly ego-transcending great process of the only by me revealed and given way of reality way of Adidam is the devotional and truly me hearing or actively ego-transcending, and thus always directly self-contraction transcending, and really me seeing or actively, directly, and fully technically responsible transcendental spiritual process of always directly and with always immediate effectiveness transcending the higher self, or the subtle and mental ego, or the total subtle dimension or subtle depth of self-contraction, and all the conceptual and perceptual illusions of inherently and necessarily brain-based mind. Therefore, the middle or subtle phase of the always directly ego-transcending practice of the only by me revealed and given reality way of Adidam requires the realization of positive disillusionment relative to the subtly objectified and subtly absorbed subject-object point of view, or fundamental release from the inherently ego-bound or thoroughly self-contracted search of relatively internalized mental and perceptual attention. This degree of the realization of positive disillusionment requires fundamental release from the inherently illusory search to experience the conditional dissolution of the ego, and in particular release from subtle states of self-contraction, and especially from mental states of self-contraction, by means of object-oriented absorptive mysticism, or the absorptive yielding of attention to the apparent subtle objects that are either originated by the brain-mind or otherwise mediated by the brain itself. And the characteristic sign of positive disillusionment relative to the permanent and complete satisfaction of the object-oriented seeking of the higher self or subject and separate subtle and mental ego is the fully me hearing and truly me seeing realization of the perfect transcendental spiritual nature of cosmic existence, or, that is to say, the realization that all natural and cosmic forms and states are inherently non-separate or intrinsically non-dual modes of universally pervasive and cosmically manifested spiritual energy, or a fundamental, indivisible, and irreducible light, or a love-bliss fullness itself. The final phase of the always directly ego-transcending great process of the only by me revealed and given reality way of Adidam is the devotional, spiritual, and transcendental hearing and seeing process of always directly and with always immediate effectiveness transcending the root self, or the root and causal ego, or the causal or root causative depth of self-contraction, which is attention itself, or the root gesture of separateness, relatedness, otherness, and difference. Therefore, as a necessary preliminary to the perfect practice of the only by me revealed and given reality way of Adidam, the ego transcending or comprehensively self-contraction transcending practice of the total course of the only by me revealed and given reality way of Adidam requires the realization of positive disillusionment relative to the causal or root egoic and therefore fundamental or original subject-object division in consciousness or conscious light itself. This degree of the realization of positive disillusionment requires the prior establishment of transcendental self-identification prior to the root self-contraction, that is, point of view itself or attention itself, and thus also prior to the entire body, brain, mind, or conditional structure of conception and perception, and the characteristic sign of positive disillusionment relative to the permanent and complete satisfaction of the root self or the fundamental causative or causal ego is the fundamental transcending of attention itself and the me locating and altogether me hearing and me seeing realization of the transcendental and intrinsically non-separate, non-dual, and non-conditional nature of consciousness itself. Only after, or in the great event of most perfect and necessarily formal and fully accountable fulfillment of the radical, or always at the root, and always intrinsically ego-transcending great process of the only by me revealed and given reality way of Adidam relative to the three fundamental modes or gross, subtle, and causal psychophysical pattern potentials of egoity, is there the truly ultimate or seventh stage and always already divinely self-realized and thus priorly intrinsically and perfectly ego-transcending practice of the only by me revealed and given reality way of Adidam, or the most perfect and intrinsically egoless or always already most perfectly and non-conditionally self-contraction transcending and divinely love bliss full and only by me revealed and given seventh stage of life demonstration of radical devotion to me. The only by me revealed and given seventh stage of life practice, or the intrinsically egoless and thus always already most perfectly and non-conditionally self-contraction transcending and altogether most perfectly divinely self-realized demonstration of the only by me revealed and given reality way of Adidam is the great esoteric, devotional, spiritual, transcendental, self-evidently divine, and most perfectly me-hearing and me-seeing demonstration of all and all divinely self-recognizing, and thus all and all divinely transcending, divine self-abiding, in and as my avatarically self-revealed divine bright sphere of self-existing, self-radiant, intrinsically egoless, perfectly subjective, and intrinsically and most perfectly body-mind transcending, or body-brain transcending, or inherently most perfectly and non-conditionally psychophysical self-contraction transcending, but never intentionally body-mind excluding, or body-brain excluding, divine acausal person, or perfect self-nature, eternal self-condition, and infinite self-state. The only by me revealed and given seventh stage of life, demonstration of the only by me revealed and given reality way of Adidam, is the non-conditional and divinely free and intrinsically egoless or intrinsically point of view-less practice, or always already divinely self-realized and inherently perfectly an inherently perfect demonstration of self-abiding divine self-recognition of the simultaneous totality of the apparent gross, subtle, and causal body-brain-mind self, or the intrinsically and perfectly all and all transcending, and at last all and all outshining process of the simultaneous and self-abiding divine self-recognition of the total psychophysical ego I itself, or of the total conditional point of view, or apparent self-contraction itself. Therefore, the only by me revealed and given seventh stage of life demonstration of the only by me revealed and given reality way of Adidam is the inherent practice or divinely self-realized demonstration of self-abiding divine self-recognition of point of view itself, or of attention itself, or of the conditionally apparent subject itself, and always coincidentally or simultaneously self-abiding divine self-recognition of the conception or perception of separateness, or of relatedness, or of otherness, or of difference itself, or of any and every conditionally apparent object itself. The only by me revealed and given seventh stage of life demonstration of the only by me revealed and given reality way of Adidam is the most perfect or non-conditional, intrinsically egoless, and self-evidently divine demonstration of positive disillusionment, or of the inherently illusionless or self-contraction free and intrinsically all and all transcending realization of the fundamental reality and truth, or real acausal God, which fundamental reality and truth, or real acausal God, is the one and indivisible and self-existing and indestructible and self-radiant and always already perfectly non-dual conscious light, and that which is always already the case, and which reality and truth, or real acausal God, is that self-existing and perfectly subjective self-brightness, or infinite and absolute and perfectly non-separate self-nature, self-condition, and self-state, of which the conditional, or gross, subtle, and causal, subject-object illusions, or total psychophysical self-contraction illusion of conception and of perception, and of the ego I presumption, are mere and merely apparent or non-necessary, or always non-ultimate and intrinsically non-binding modifications, and the characteristic sign of most perfectly demonstrated or seventh stage positive disillusionment relative to the totality of the separate and separative ego I, or point of view, and its presumptions of a separate or objectified gross, subtle, and causal world, is intrinsically egoless and self-evidently divine, and intrinsically non-separate, and non-dual realization of reality itself as irreducible and indivisible conscious light, inherently love blissful, or perfectly subjectively bright. Therefore, the only by me revealed and given reality way of Adidam or Adidam Ruchiradam is, from the beginning and at last, the way of positive disillusionment. The only by me revealed and given reality way of Adidam or Adidam Ruchiradam is, from the beginning and at last, the way of always direct and always immediately effective transcending of the fact and the consequences of egoity or of psychophysical self-contraction. The only by me revealed and given reality way of Adidam or Adidam Ruchiradam is, from the beginning and at last, the way of always direct and always immediately effective transcending of the illusions of inherently egoic attention or of the conditionally presumed subject-object pattern of conception and perception. The only by me revealed and given reality way of Adidam or Adidam Ruchiradam is, from the beginning and at last, the way of the always direct and always immediately effective transcending of the total illusory pattern of the inherently egoic presumption of separateness, relatedness, otherness, and difference. The only by me revealed and given reality way of Adidam or Adidam Ruchiradam is, from the beginning and at last, the way of the always direct and always immediately effective transcending of the always simultaneous illusions of the separate ego I and the separate or merely objective world. The only by me revealed and given reality way of Adidam or Adidam Ruchiradam is, from the beginning and at last, the way of the always direct or intrinsically egoless and intrinsically illusionless realizing of the one and irreducible conscious light or perfectly subjective transcendental spiritual self-brightness of being that is reality itself and truth itself, or real acausal God. The only by me revealed and given reality way of Adidam or Adidam Ruchiradam is, from the beginning and at last, the way of the always direct or intrinsically egoless and intrinsically illusionless realizing of the conscious loveless energy of the perfect and perfectly indivisible totality. The only by me revealed and given reality way of Adidam or Adidam Ruchiradam is, from the beginning and at last, the way of the always direct and always immediately effective realizing of only me. 16. The collective great tradition of humankind is a combination of exoteric and esoteric developments and revelations and realizations that comprises and is, in its entirety, limited by and to only the first 6 of the potential 7 stages of life. I alone am the avatarically self-manifested divine self-revelation of the 7th stage of life. I alone am the Adidam revelation. The human entity, and even any and every conditionally manifested entity of any and every kind, is inherently deluded by its own egoic or self-contracted experience and knowledge. The first 6 stages of life are the 6 stages or developmental phases of human and universal egoity, or of progressively regressive introversion upon the psychophysical pattern and point of view of self-contraction. The first 6 stages of life are the universally evident developmental stages of the knowing and experiencing of the potential illusions inherently associated with the patterns or the universally extended cosmic psychophysical structure of conditionally manifested existence. Because each and all of the first 6 stages of life are based on and are identical to egoity or self-contraction, or separate and separative point of view itself, not any one or even the collective of all of the first 6 stages of life directly and most perfectly realizes or is the intrinsically egoless and inherently most perfect realization and the intrinsically egoless and inherently most perfect demonstration of reality itself, truth itself, or real, a causal God. The first 6 stages of life develop successively on the psychophysically predetermined or pre-patterned basis of the inherent and progressively unfolding structure and self-contracted point of view of the conditionally arising body, brain, mind, self. The first 6 stages of life are a conditional and therefore ultimately non-necessary or inherently transcendable illusion of psychophysically pre-patterned experience or conditional knowing, structured according to the subject-object or attention versus object or point of view versus objective world convention of conditional conception and conditional perception. The first 6 stages of life are, each and all, based upon the illusion of duality, suggested by the subject-object convention of conditional conception and conditional perception. Reality itself, or that which is always already the case, is inherently one, or perfectly non-dual. The only by me revealed and given reality way of Adidam is the unique 7th stage way of radical non-dualism, or the one and only way that directly and at last most perfectly realizes the one and only and intrinsically egoless reality itself, truth itself, or real, a causal God. The only by me revealed and given reality way of Adidam is the unique and only way that always, directly, and at last most perfectly transcends egoity or self-contraction itself. The only by me revealed and given reality way of Adidam is the practice and the process of transcending egoity or psychophysical self-contraction, or gross, subtle, and causal egoic self-identification with separate and separative point of view, by always directly transcending the inherently egoic or always self-contracted patterns of conditional conception and conditional perception, or of conditional knowing and conditional experiencing associated with each and all of the first 6 stages of life. I am Adida, the avatar of reality itself, here born as the divine avataric world teacher, Adida Samraj, the first, the last, and the only 7th stage divine avataric realizer, divine avataric revealer, and divine avataric self-revelation of reality itself, truth itself, and real acausal God. I am the intrinsically egoless, perfectly subjective, perfectly non-dual, and self-evidently divine self-nature, self-condition, source condition, and self-state of every apparent point of view, and of the apparently objective world itself. I am the one and irreducible and indestructible and self-existing and self-radiant conscious light that is always already the case. I am the self-bright substance of reality itself. I am the person or self-nature, self-condition, and self-state of reality itself. In my bodily human form, I am the avataric self-manifestation of the one and self-evidently divine reality itself. By means of my divine avataric self-emergence, I am functioning, now and forever hereafter, as the realizer, the revealer, and the self-revelation, or universally, transcendentally, spiritually present person of reality itself, which is truth itself, and which is the one real or non-illusory and intrinsically egoless and perfectly subjective God, or self-evidently divine self-nature, self-condition, self-state, and perfectly acausal source condition of all and all. My divine avataric self-revelation illuminates and outshines the ego I of my devotee. My divine avataric teaching word of me revelation comprehends and transcends the all of egoity and the all of the cosmic domain. Here ends the recitation of the Aletheon, the divine avataric self-revelation of his divine presence, Avatar Adi Da Samraj.